Samia Shahid. She was born and raised in Manningham, Bradford. Now, this was a diverse community for sure, but also a traditionally conservative one, a place where family honor and, cultural expectations, they really played a huge part in day-to-day life. Her parents, Muhammad Shahid and Imtiaz Bibi, were originally from Pakistan, and they kept these really strong ties to their home village, a place called Panduri in the Punjab region. From the time she was a little girl, Samia was basically expected to fall in line with her family's values, deference to her elders, sticking to cultural traditions, and above all, preserving the family's reputation. That was paramount. But despite all those expectations, Samia was known for having this independent spirit. She got an education and eventually started working as a beauty therapist. And that career choice, it really reflected her own personal ambition and this deep desire she had for financial independence. But as a young British Pakistani woman, she was always walking this delicate line between modern Western influences and these very traditional South Asian customs. Her family practiced arranged marriages, a deeply ingrained cultural norm that really emphasized keeping unions within the extended family. It was a way to preserve their lineage and their honor. For Samia, this would become a defining factor in her whole life. She grew up with the understanding that marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was a decision that had to have the consent and the approval of her parents. And even though Samia was close with her family, there were times when she let her frustration show over the restrictions placed on her. Her friends would later say that she just wanted more control over her own future, especially when it came to her personal and romantic life. She was trying to create her own identity, something separate from the traditional roles that were expected of her as a daughter and a future wife. At home, she was facing this immense pressure from her family and her community to just abide by the norms. But then outside the house, she was being exposed to a completely different world, one that championed individual rights and personal freedoms. This contrast, you knew it was eventually going to lead to a conflict as Samia started to assert her own desires in a way that directly challenged everything that was expected of her. Her upbringing, while loving in a lot of ways, was also dictated by these really rigid gender roles. And she understood that stepping outside of those predefined boundaries, well, it could have some pretty serious consequences. It was in this environment that Samia became an adult, kind of setting the stage for the choices she was about to make. Choices that would not only define her fate, but would also expose this really dangerous intersection of culture, control, and autonomy. So in 2012, at the age of 25, Samia Shahid was married to her first cousin, Chaudhry Muhammad Shakil. It was an arranged union that had been in the works for years. The marriage was organized by her family, following that common practice of keeping marriages inside the family to strengthen ties and maintain their cultural traditions. Shakil, who lived in Panduri, Pakistan, was a man Samia barely knew. Their lives had been shaped by completely different worlds. She was in the UK, he was in Pakistan. The wedding took place in Pakistan, and they were surrounded by relatives who were all celebrating what they thought was a proper match. For Samia, though, oh God, the marriage quickly proved to be anything but ideal. So while she was outwardly doing what her family expected of her, she was really struggling to adjust to the relationship. Friends and coworkers later said she'd confided in them, telling them she felt trapped in a marriage that just didn't line up with her own aspirations. And one of the biggest concerns for both Shakil and Samia's family was getting him immigrated to the UK. After they got married, they started making efforts to get him a spousal visa, but those attempts just didn't work out. As a result, Samia was forced to split her life between two worlds, spending time in Pakistan with her husband, then flying back to the UK for work, and this arrangement, it put a serious strain on what was already a really fragile marriage. You see, Shakil expected his wife to just embrace the traditional role of a submissive spouse, but Samia, she had very different expectations. She was independent, she was career-oriented, and she was getting more and more disillusioned with the constraints that were being put on her. The cultural norms that said a wife had to be subservient. They just clashed with her growing desire to control her own damn life. Over time, her unhappiness just became impossible to ignore. As the months went by, Samia tried to find ways to assert herself in the marriage, but her resistance was always met with disapproval. Conversations she had with people close to her suggested that she felt isolated and just deeply unhappy. The lack of any real emotional connection with Shaquille, combined with the constant pressure of her family's expectations, just made her turmoil that much deeper. In the end, she made the incredibly difficult decision to leave him, and she was fully aware of the consequences she was probably going to face. Divorce wasn't just a personal decision here. It was an act that would challenge these deeply held family values. And yet, despite the inevitable fallout, Samia knew she couldn't stay in a relationship that denied her any autonomy. Her decision to leave was more than just a break from Shaquille. It was a complete rejection of the life that had been planned out for her. But as she was about to find out, walking away from an arranged marriage wasn't going to be as simple as signing some legal papers to number. It was going to ignite tensions that would follow her wherever she went. After she ended her marriage to Chaudhry Mohammed Shakil, she faced immediate resistance. Her family, who was so deeply invested in keeping up their social standing, was strongly against her choice. Divorce was rare in their circle, and the fact that Samia was leaving a cousin, that just made their disapproval even more intense. Relatives and community members tried to talk her out of it, warning her about the dishonor she was bringing on herself and everyone connected to her. But she was undeterred. She finalized her divorce and then took the incredibly bold step of remarrying. In September of 2015, she married Syed Mukhtar Kazim, a man she had chosen for herself. And unlike her first arranged marriage, this union was based on love and mutual understanding. With Kazim, Samia saw a new beginning, a life free from the constraints that had suffocated her in the past. After they were married, the couple moved to Dubai, a city that gave them some distance from the disapproving eyes of her relatives in both the UK and Pakistan. And it was here that Samia started building a life on her own terms. She really leaned into her career and just enjoyed the freedoms that came with her newfound independence. Friends noted how much happier and more confident she seemed now that she wasn't burdened by the expectations that had once dictated all of her choices. Her family's reaction to her second marriage, though, was anything but supportive. To them, what she did wasn't just rebellious, it was outright disgraceful. Reports suggest that they made attempts to pressure her into reconsidering her decision, with different family members begging her to come back. Samia, however, stood firm. She had escaped a marriage that had brought her nothing but misery, and she had no intention of going back. As time went on, the tensions between Samia and her family just kept escalating. She received message after message from relatives. Some were laced with emotional blackmail, others were just outright hostile. The pressure got so intense that her family reportedly disowned her, a really drastic move that was meant to punish her for what they saw as a betrayal. But even with the estrangement, Samia didn't cut off all contact. No, she still talked with certain family members, but, she was cautious about it. Her father and her sister specifically stayed in touch, even though their conversations were often pretty strained. And it was inside this really complex dynamic that the events leading to her fateful trip to Pakistan started to unfold. In July of 2016, Samia got some really distressing news. She was told that her father was gravely ill and that she needed to get back to Pakistan immediately. She was worried about him, and maybe she was hopeful that this trip could be a step towards some kind of reconciliation. So she made the decision to travel back to her family's village. Her husband, Kazim, was really uneasy about the trip. He knew all about the hostility from her family and was terrified for her safety. He basically begged her not to go, but Samia, holding on to this belief that her father was sick and needed her, she insisted on making the journey. What she didn't know was that this visit wasn't going to be the family reunion she was hoping for. Instead, it was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated trap, one she would never return from. On July 14th, 2016, Samia Shahid got on a flight from Dubai to Islamabad, Pakistan. She'd been told her father, Mohammed Shahid, was critically ill, and despite all the tension with her family, she felt like it was her duty to be there by his side. When she arrived, Samia traveled to Panjuri, her family's village in the Punjab region. The rural setting was just a stark contrast to the life she had built for herself in Dubai. It was a place where tradition ran daily life, where family honor dictated every personal choice, and where she was once expected to conform to cultural norms she had since rejected. Her return was met with a reception that seemed, at first, surprisingly warm. Her family welcomed her into their home, and they didn't show any signs of resentment about her divorce or her remarriage. This whole display of affection, it actually put Samia at ease, and it made her believe that maybe, just maybe, reconciliation was possible. She called her husband right after she got there, telling him that things seemed to be going well, but the situation, it soon took a very troubling turn. Within a day of her arrival, Samia realized that her father wasn't nearly as sick as she'd been led to believe. The sense of urgency that had pushed her to make the trip, it seemed to be based on a lie, and this revelation really unsettled her. It raised some serious concerns about why she had been deceived in the first place. Over the next few days, communicating with the outside world became more and more difficult for Samia. Her husband was struggling to reach her, and he was only getting these brief messages that seemed uncharacteristic. Friends and relatives who tried to check on her just got these vague answers from her family. The whole atmosphere in the house grew tense, and Samia started to suspect that she wasn't just a guest in her family's home. She was being held there against her will. Then, on July 19th, Samia managed to make a desperate phone call to her husband, Kazim. In these hushed tones, she told him she feared for her life, and she urged him to please help her. She said she was in danger, but couldn't say anything else before the call was abruptly cut off. Alarmed, Jesus Christ, Kazim tried to contact her again, but his messages just went unanswered. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, Kazim immediately reached out to the authorities, pleading for them to intervene. He contacted British and Pakistani officials, just desperate to raise the alarm about what was happening to his wife. He also reached out to Samia's friends and supporters, urging them to apply pressure to make sure she was safe. But it was too late. The next day, on July 20th, 2016, the news broke that Samia Shahid had been found dead in her family's home in Pendhuri. Her relatives claimed she had died of natural causes, specifically a sudden heart attack. But the circumstances around her death, especially when you consider that last phone call to her husband, suggested something else entirely. As word of her death spread, the suspicion just mounted. Kazim, who was completely convinced that his wife had been murdered, refused to accept the family's story. He immediately demanded an investigation, stating that Samia had been lured to Pakistan under false pretenses and killed in a so-called honor revenge. Within hours, what had initially been reported as a tragic but natural death, it spiraled into an international case of a suspected honor killing. Authorities now faced this growing pressure to find out the truth about what happened to Samia in her final hours, and whether she had been silenced for daring to choose her own path in life. The news of Samia Shahid's sudden death on July 20th, 2016 sent shockwaves through everyone who knew her. Her family claimed she'd suffered a fatal heart attack, but their story was met with immediate skepticism. Samia had been a healthy 28-year-old woman with no known medical conditions. Just days earlier, she had told her husband, Syed Mukhtar Kazim, that she was afraid for her life. And now, she was gone. Kazim was the first one to raise the alarm, just rejecting the family's explanation outright. He believed Samia had been murdered, and he wasted no time demanding an autopsy. His suspicions were shared by others who knew about Samia's turbulent history with her family. The circumstances of her death, plus the deception they used to lure her to Pakistan in the first place, it all pointed to a calculated act, not some medical emergency. Local authorities at first, seemed hesitant to treat the case as suspicious. The police initially just accepted the family's version of events without much scrutiny. The body was quickly prepared for burial, which is in line with Islamic customs, but Kazim intervened before she could be laid to rest. He insisted on a forensic examination, absolutely determined to find out the truth. So, under this growing pressure, an initial postmortem was conducted at a hospital in Pakistan. And the preliminary findings contradicted everything the family had claimed. There were no signs of a heart attack. Instead, early reports suggested possible asphyxiation. The presence of bruises around her neck raised chilling questions about whether she had been strangled. As the suspicions intensified, media outlets started reporting on the case, and it drew widespread attention. A British MP named Naz Shah, who had been very vocal about issues affecting British Pakistani women, took a personal interest in Samia's death. She pushed for a thorough investigation, really urging the Pakistani authorities to treat the case as a potential honor killing, not a natural death. And this mounting scrutiny put immense pressure on Samia's family, especially her father and her ex-husband, since both of them had been in the house when she died. And the inconsistencies in what they were saying, well, it just deepened everyone's suspicions. Initially, they insisted she had died in her sleep. But then, when they were confronted with the autopsy results, their stories shifted. With global attention now focused on the case, Pakistani authorities, they really had no choice but to act. A much deeper investigation was launched, which led to the questioning of several family members. As forensic experts conducted a more detailed examination, the truth about Samia's final moments began to emerge. And it pointed to a crime that was driven by revenge, control, and this deeply rooted belief in preserving family honor. A second postmortem was ordered, this time done by a whole team of forensic experts. And the results confirmed what so many had feared. Samia had not died of natural causes. The examination revealed clear signs of strangulation with deep bruising around her neck and evidence of forced asphyxiation. Damn. The findings just completely shattered the family's claims of a heart attack and strengthened the suspicions that this was an honor killing. With this damning evidence, Pakistani authorities moved in to detain the key suspects. Samia's father, Mohammed Shahid, and her ex-husband, Chaudhry Mohammed Shakil, were both taken into custody. Shakil, who had stayed in Pakistan after their divorce, he quickly became the prime suspect. Investigators suspected that he was the one who had carried out the killing, and that he did it with the approval and maybe even the help of Samia's father. As the interrogations started, the discrepancies in their stories became really obvious. Shakil initially denied he had anything to do with it, but after prolonged questioning, his story started to crumble. Eventually, he reportedly confessed to strangling Samia, claiming it was an act to restore the family's honor. According to investigators, he admitted that the family had conspired to lure her to Pakistan with a fake story, knowing that she would never have willingly returned otherwise. But even with Shakil's alleged confession, the case was still incredibly complex. See, Pakistani law had historically allowed honor killings to go unpunished. There were these legal loopholes that let the victim's family forgive the perpetrators, who were often, relatives. This legal provision meant that even if Shakil was found guilty, Samia's immediate family could potentially pardon him, which would allow him to just walk free. Meanwhile, Samia's mother and sister were publicly defending the family, denying any wrongdoing. They insisted that Shakil's confession had been coerced, and they claimed Samia's death was being politicized. But their defense really did little to counter the growing evidence against the accused. As the investigation moved forward, more details emerged about the planning that went into this crime. Phone records and witness testimony suggested that the whole trip had been a premeditated setup. As the case against Chaudhry, Mohammed Shakil, and Mohammed Shahid moved to the courts, legal hurdles started popping up almost immediately. Despite Shakil's reported confession, the defense tried to challenge how valid his statements were, claiming he was coerced by the authorities. Meanwhile, Samia Shahid's mother and sister publicly defended the accused, just insisting that the allegations were completely baseless. One of the biggest concerns was Pakistan's legal framework around honor killings. For years, this loophole in the law allowed families to forgive perpetrators who were often relatives, and that enabled them to just escape any punishment. This possibility hung over the case, and it fueled fears that Shaquille and Samia's father could be freed if their relatives decided to pardon them. Under intense scrutiny from international media and women's rights activists, Pakistani officials assured the public that justice would be served. The government had recently passed new legislation that was aimed at closing that forgiveness loophole, and prosecutors wanted to make sure that the new law would be applied in Samia's case. But the trial, oh man, it was slow moving. Delays, procedural hurdles, and conflicting testimonies just made progress incredibly difficult. At times, it really seemed like the case might stall out indefinitely, just lost in the bureaucratic maze of Pakistan's judicial system. Still, pressure from Samia's husband, Syed Mukhtar Kazim, and that British MP, Naz Shah, kept the case in the public eye. While he was awaiting trial, Mohammed Shahid was granted bail because of his deteriorating health, which just complicated the proceedings even more. Shaquille remained in custody, but his legal team continued to fight the charges, trying to cast doubt on the forensic findings and questioning how reliable the statements were. Years after Samia's death, the legal battle remained unresolved. Her case became a symbol of the ongoing fight against honor killings in Pakistan, and it exposed both the progress that had been made and the persistent flaws in the country's legal system. Whether true justice would ever be served, well, that remained an open question, one that many feared might never be answered. All right. So that's where the legal case stands, or, where it's stalled, and it leaves you with this just chilling, unresolved feeling. A confession that's been challenged, a legal system with built-in trapdoors, and a family that's either grieving a tragic loss or hiding a monstrous crime. Samia Shahid's story became this huge symbol, a public battleground over honor, culture, and a woman's right to just live. But in the end, the question of real, concrete justice for her, it just kind of hangs there in the air, unanswered. And when you step back from the legal mess and the headlines, you have to ask yourself, what was it, really, that drove this whole tragedy? What was the key factor? Honestly, it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect, god-awful storm. The central conflict, the thing that lit the fuse, was Samia's fierce desire for personal freedom, crashing head-on into a rigid, patriarchal honor code that saw her independence not as a strength, but as a stain on the family's reputation. To her, marrying for love and living on her own terms was a fundamental right. To them, it was an act of rebellion so profound that it needed to be erased. The control was everything. Her choices weren't seen as her own. They were seen as a reflection on her father, her male relatives, her entire lineage. When she divorced a man they chose and married a man she chose, she wasn't just ending a marriage, she was seizing control of her own narrative. And in that world, a woman holding the pen to her own story was the ultimate threat. That loss of control, that perceived dishonor, that was the poison. It festered for years, fueled by Shaquille's resentment and the family's deep-seated belief that their reputation was more valuable than her life. It was a tragedy set in motion, not by a single moment of rage, but by an entire cultural framework where a woman's autonomy is seen as a liability. So what's the moral here? I mean, what can you possibly take away from something so awful? I guess the grimmest lesson is that sometimes the greatest danger comes disguised as love and family duty. The people who are supposed to protect you can become the ones you need protection from. Samia was lured back not by enemies, but by the supposed illness of her own father. She was trapped, not in a stranger's house, but in her childhood home. The calls for her to come back weren't just about reconciliation, they were about regaining control. The moral is that isolation is a predator's greatest weapon. They cut her off, controlled her communication, and created a world where only their version of reality existed. And once she was in that world, she was completely vulnerable. And that brings us to the hard part, the part that actually matters. How do you stop this from happening to someone else? What are the key things to look out for? Believe me, this is serious. First, be wary of the lure. The family emergency is a classic tactic. A sick parent, a sudden crisis. It's designed to trigger your love and your guilt to get you to drop everything and travel to a place where you are not safe. If you are estranged from your family because of choices you've made about your life and you suddenly get a desperate call like that, stop. Take a breath. You have to verify it independently. Call a different neutral relative in the area. Contact your country's embassy or consulate in that region and tell them the situation. Tell them you're being pressured to travel and you're concerned for your safety. They can sometimes help verify the story or at least be aware of your travel plans. Do not get on a plane based on one frantic phone call. Second, never, ever give up your independence in communication. This was crucial in Samia's case. Once she was there, they took her passport, they controlled her phone. Before you would ever make a trip like that, you need a rock-solid safety plan. Leave copies of your passport, driver's license, and your full itinerary with multiple trusted friends. Set up mandatory scheduled check-in times. If your friend doesn't hear from you at 8 p.m. every single night, they know to immediately contact the authorities. Have a code word or a distress signal, a seemingly innocent phrase you can text or say on the phone that means, "I'm in danger, get help now." And for God's sake, know the exact location and number of your embassy or the nearest consulate. It is your lifeline. Third, and this is the hardest one, learn to recognize emotional blackmail as a weapon. The talk of honor, of bringing shame on the family, of what will people say, that is not a discussion. That is a threat. It's a tool to control you through guilt. Samia's family pressured her for years. When you feel that intense, suffocating pressure, when your gut is screaming that something is wrong, you have to trust it. That feeling is your survival instinct. Your life is worth more than anyone's idea of honor. Look, if you or anyone you know in the United States is facing this kind of pressure or is in a situation involving domestic violence or the threat of honor-based violence, there is help. You are not alone in this. You can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Their number is 1-800-799-7233. That's 1-800-799-SAFE. They are available 24/7. It's confidential, and they can connect you with resources in your area. Please don't wait until it's too late.